here is Mike Pence's, or the former Mike Pence's counsel, Greg Jacob. He's being interviewed by, or I should say questioned by, Representative Pete Aguilar from California. And Jacob is relating what John Eastman related to Mike Pence. John Eastman is essentially Donald Trump's coup lawyer. John Eastman, there are emails that he had to deliver to the committee, show that he had been in contact with Clarence Thomas's wife, Ginny. And not just in contact, I mean, they're conspiring. I don't know what else to say. Like, they're trying to figure out how they overthrow the election. I should also say John Eastman was also Clarence Thomas's former clerk. So the relationship runs deep here. And here is what Eastman is telling, here's what Jacob is relating that Eastman was telling Pence prior to January 6th.
Jacob, did Dr. Eastman say whether he would want other vice presidents such as Al Gore after the 2000 election or Kamala Harris after the 2024 election to have the power to decide the outcome of the election?
So this was one of the many points that we discussed on January 5th. He had come into that meeting trying to persuade us that there was some validity to his theory. I viewed it as my objective to persuade him to acknowledge he was just wrong. And I thought this had to be one of the most powerful.
Pause it for 1 second. Again, I know we made this point earlier in terms of, like, all of Mike Pence's great, sort of like integrity and whatnot. Mike Pence is under no obligation to meet with John Eastman.
Of course.
But and if Greg Jacob, the counsel to the vice president, feels like he needs to convince John Eastman he's wrong. No, he needs to convince Pence that John Eastman is wrong. Let's be clear what's going on here. As late as the 5th, Pence is still like, I'm on the fence about this. Mm-hmm. And the lawyers around Pence are like, this reminds me of like when there was a story that came out about Governor LePage in Maine. You remember this? Where he kept inviting sovereign citizens to his office, and they were telling him, like, you have the right to assassinate the leader of the Senate in Maine because he's not agreeing with you, and all the power lies with the sheriffs. And LePage's lawyers were all around going like, we can't let these people in there anymore. Why is John Eastman even getting into the vice president's office 4 months after the election is over? Like, why would Mike Pence even care unless he thought like, it's on the table. It's on the table.
Yeah.
Continue.
Yeah.
Persuade him to acknowledge he was just wrong. And I thought this had to be one of the most powerful arguments. I mean, John, back in 2000, you weren't jumping up and saying Al Gore had this authority to do that. You would not want Kamala Harris to be able to exercise that kind of authority in 2024 when I hope Republicans will win the election. And I know you hope that too, John. And he said, absolutely. Al Gore did not have a basis to do it in 2000. Kamala Harris shouldn't be able to do it in 2024, but I think you should do it today.
I mean, what if Eastman was sort of adept enough at saying like, yeah, no, they could have. Well, okay. Well, then Mike will do it. I mean.
Yeah, I mean, that was just, I thought that was just such a great illustration of the entire coup plot that was going on, which, by the way, Mike Pence was aware of. They knew it was illegal. They knew it was unconstitutional. It was just a sheer power play. Just we can do it, but we won't let them do it. And that is just how they operate.
And here again is another example of what I think is the Democrats' failure here. Because the question is, why was John Eastman in that office on January 5th? Like, why was Mike Pence entertaining it? Like, give us a sense, Greg Jacob, where was Pence at this point? Was he 95% against this? So he's 5% for it? Or was he 20% for it? Or 30% for it? I mean, if your agenda was to get Eastman to admit that he's wrong, why was that important? I mean, how far down the road was Mike Pence on this? Like, how many different people did Mike Pence need to exhibit to him that this is wrong? We know Quayle. We know the Ludwig. We now know that you and other attorneys are sitting there trying to make Eastman look like a fool, which doesn't look that hard. Was he still not convinced even as late as January 5th? Like, I mean, this is the question, but the Democrats have this sort of like problem, and they think that they need to show there are good Republicans.
Yeah.
And this is the problem. Like, there's two things that are going on here with these hearings. One is it's super important to have this on the record historically. I should say three. It's super important to tell people who actually take this seriously as to like what the outlines of the plan was and figure out how to thwart this in 2024 before it starts rolling.
Right.
But the third thing is you want some political value out of it. You want to explain to the American public there is a malignancy in this party. And in addition to the fact that Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden are out there saying we need to appeal to the good Republicans, in addition to the fact that they're out there trying to message uber MAGA as opposed to MAGA as opposed to Republican, is also muddying the waters. But they're also like trying to protect Pence as a sort of the white knight because they think he's okay. We can beat him. And this is like, we're going to create, we're trying to drive a wedge within the Republican Party. It is not working. You need to motivate non-Republicans to go out and vote against Republicans. That is the problem with 2022. Ultimately, it's the problem with 2024. But 2022, the dynamic before a word is said is that 2/3 of the Democrats come out to vote and 3/4 of the Republicans need to that come out to vote. That's just the way it is. And you need to say to all of the people who would vote against Republicans, there's a real reason to do it because they're all bad.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. That's in fact, I think I put up a post yesterday that I think Bernie Sanders had a good op-ed in The Guardian yesterday talking about that, just saying, look, we have to run against Republicans. We have to run against them. They're destroying democracy. They're trying to, they're taking food out of the mouths of children. They want to, have guns in every school. I mean, this idea somehow that you're, simultaneously saying, well, Republicans are okay, but MAGAs aren't okay. But we want to run against Republicans and MAGAs, and it's confusing, and I think that it does dilute the political value of these hearings, which are tremendous in my view. I mean, the political value should be overwhelming, and it should be. And we'll be interested to see if there's any change in polling. So far, there isn't, but over time, maybe if there's some revelations that people finally glom onto. But the point is that they are. I mean, I understand why they're using Republicans to tell the story. You have to. It's a Republican scandal. There's, Democrats had basically nothing to do with what was going on that day. So you have to do that. But there could be more skillful sort of.
I don't care if you make.
Underlying, subtext here of, like asking Jacob that question would have been very interesting. Asking Jacob, why were you letting John Eastman into the office? What was the point of that? Why didn't you just not take his calls? Why was it necessary to continually be arguing with him? What was the problem there? Why was Mike Pence having second thoughts, and of course,
first thoughts, needed to have second thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, they're all going, well, he was steely and determined, well, they could have probed that a little bit, I think, and without, risking the idea of getting cooperation. I mean, I'm not saying that it's necessarily an easy task, but these are, the skillful. They have skillful lawyers. They have skillful prosecutors. They have, and of course, you want to get Trump. I get that. Trump was the lead on this whole thing. But it is very important. And I'll just come back to the fact that there were people like Mike Lee and Lindsey Graham and Jim Jordan and, a lot of
Ted
people.
Cruz. I mean, all these people.
who were in on this, who understood exactly what was being attempted and attempted to help them, and were working with them on accomplishing this. And that's really an important thing to know. And I don't think that most Americans, even those who are following this, know that. I think they think this was Trump and Rudy and these weirdos, and
because they're allowing the committee is allowing them to make these distinctions. And the question you needed for Jacob is pretty straightforward. Where was Mike Pence at this moment? Oh, he was totally against it. Then why were you even meeting with Eastman? Why would you waste the vice president's last day in office? Or why are you meeting with why? I mean, that's the moment that should be out there. The message that they have failed to convey, which is really the only message that you can expect the American public to absorb. Republicans bad. Republicans bad. I mean, if people want to dig deeper into it, you're providing all of the you're providing the receipts. Mm-hmm. But the message at the end of the day has to be Republicans bad.
Right.
Even if it's like Democrats, not great, maybe not even good, but just not as bad. That's it right there. Republicans so bad that and they failed to do that. And even just all right, let's play this one more clip. I mean, because I would have been fine with people well, Mike Pence was completely gunning for American democracy. But, I got to say, Greg Jacob seems, like a fairly stand-up guy. I mean, you know what? That's okay. That's okay. Here is Greg Jacob. He's being questioned by the committee counsel, John Wood, on the fact that John Eastman conspiring with Ginny Thomas. Now it is being revealed, and the committee is questioning whether they're going to bring this up. This goes to the heart of what my complaint is. How do you make this argument and not bring this up? It's absurd. It is nuts. But they want to protect, and they've done this since the day Donald Trump announced. They want to protect a certain segment of Republicans, and it's
well. And if I could just add that this goes to something that's very, very important about the coup itself, which I think, and I wrote about it this morning in my piece for Salon. By protecting this Ginny Thomas thing and kind of, refusing to really delve into that as a particular aspect of this coup, it means they would have to ignore something that's come up in the whole Eastman testimony about Eastman. It came up yesterday. Two different people, Jacob and this other guy, Hirschman, who was part of the White House counsel's office, both said that they talked to Eastman about, okay, let's say Pence does this. What happens then, right? That was the big question, one we've all been wondering. Well, what did they think was going to happen after they stole it like that? We were all going to shrug our shoulders and say, yeah, well, I guess that's that and move on. I mean, we did in 2000, so maybe we'd do it again. Maybe that's what they counted on. But the truth is that they knew there was going to be violence. They understood that there was going to be violence. But Eastman's view, which I thought was so interesting yesterday, was that the court was not going to take up the case. He said the court will not take it up under the political involvement doctrine, or something, it's called something like that, that they wouldn't touch it because it was too much of a hot potato for the court to get into. They would just leave that alone and sort of say, well, look, the political branches have to work this out themselves. And so Jacob says, well, there's, then it's like a constitutional jump ball was how he described it. He goes, it's a standoff basically, and there's nothing. And the only result of that would end up being violence in the streets. And Eastman said, yes, but that's happened many times in our history when people protected democracy and the republic. So that knowledge that Eastman had, now, did he get it from his good friend Ginny and Clarence, who he'd known since he was a clerk? Did he have some understanding that the court had decided not to take up the case? I don't know, but that's a very salient and important question, I think, that needs to be asked, because what were they planning after Mike Pence did his job?
We've heard from much reporting that Donald Trump wanted to impose the Insurrection Act.
Absolutely.
And that's what would have happened next. The Insurrection Act would have been imposed. And one of the things that I think has been a failure of these hearings, or remains to be seen, I want to hear from, I know that they interviewed these people earlier, but I want to see on TV the military people being hauled up in front of there, the National Guard, the Capitol Police, and the military, and find out exactly why the orders, why there was 15 guards guarding the Capitol that day, when it was clear that there was an awareness both with the insurrectionists and the police force that there could be problems. Well, the insurrectionists knew what they were doing. They were scouting. But the police knew, and why there was this slow sort of response. And to the extent they got any orders, it was to protect the protesters. But here is Greg Jacob. Eastman's still working on it on January 7th, rather. Listen to this.
And the speeches that the majority and minority leaders had been allowed to make also violated the Electoral Count Act, because they hadn't been counted against the debate time. And then he implored me, now that we have established that the Electoral Count Act isn't so sacrosanct as you have made it out to be, I implore you one last time, can the Vice President please do what we've been asking him to do these last 2 days? Suspend the joint session, send it back to the states.
And we'll show you the text of that email, which Dr. Eastman wrote at 11:44 p.m. on January 6th. So after the attack on the Capitol and after law enforcement had secured the Capitol, he still wrote, as you described, quote, "So now that the precedent has been set that the Electoral Count Act is not quite so sacrosanct as was previously claimed, I implore you to consider one more relatively minor violation and adjourn for 10 days to allow the legislatures to finish their investigations." So even after the attack on the Capitol had been quelled, Dr. Eastman requested, in writing no less, that the Vice President violate the law by delaying the certification and sending the question back to the states. Is that correct, Mr. Jacob?
It is.
Did you eventually share Dr. Eastman's proposal with Vice President Pence?
Not right at that time, because the Vice President was completing the work that it was his duty to do. But a day or two later, back at the White House, I did show him that final email from Mr. Eastman.
And what was Vice President Pence's reaction when you showed him the email where Dr. Eastman, after the attack on the Capitol, still asked that the Vice President delay certification and send it back to the states?
He said, "That's rubber room stuff."
I can't help but think, if Jacobs wanted to hold that email back a couple of days.
Yeah.
I mean, I like to think maybe Pence would have said that's rubber room stuff on that day, but
who knows?
If Jacob is opening that email on the evening of the 6th, right?
Yeah, why?
Well, aside from why is he he's opening that email? I imagine he was in close contact with Pence, if not there.
He was with him. He was with him that whole day.
You can't believe what Eastman's saying now. I don't think Jacob had that level of confidence in Mike Pence to share that email at that time.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but you're absolutely right.
Yeah, let's get a load of this guy that we were taking seriously recently.
Yeah, remember 24 hours ago where I was having to make this guy look like he was in a rubber room so that you wouldn't sign on to this? What's the rubber room part? 3 days ago, you had this guy in your office and you took him very, very seriously.
Right. He argued with him for hours. This is so interesting because I really hadn't quite put this together till you bring it up. This idea, the idea that he spent hours with this guy on January 5th. He said he was there. They arguing back and forth with him for hours.
There's no value. There's no value to Mike Pence to convince Eastman that he's wrong here. There's only value to Mike Pence to find out if he can do it because he wanted to do it.
Right.
He was making an assessment.
Yeah.
He was making an assessment. What's the best move for Mike Pence? Is it to sort of let this die and keep my career going 4 years from now? Or is it to become vice president again for another 4 years and then rerun then? Am I going to get away with this? That's what these arguments were about. Am I going to get away with this? And fortunately, I guess, for all of us, Eastman is such a lunatic that only Ginny Thomas and Clarence Thomas are on his wavelength. But
well, I mean, very interesting. And I think that one of the things that does work against Mike Pence in all of this, that the hearings, and I think it's totally inadvertent. I don't think they're doing this on purpose. But the fact that he was, that he's being sort of portrayed as a big hero, right? I mean, he stood up, he was steely and determined, and he said, no, I will not do it. I shall not do, I shall defend the Constitution or whatever. But the fact is that, Trump was calling him a pussy to his face that day. And then he, did his thing, and he stood up that day and said, he went ahead and counted the votes like it was a big deal. But ever since then, he's acted like exactly what Donald Trump called him. I mean, I hate to say it, but that guy, Mike Pence, is out there being as, worm-like as you can possibly be about this. I mean, if he were truly this hero, he'd be testifying, right? He'd be up there saying, whatever. Instead, he's kind of walking around going, I'm trying to move on. We'll never see eye to eye on that day and blah, blah, blah. He's going on. And, that's, to me, I think that by portraying him as a hero in that day, by saying that they were trying to murder him, right? They said basically that, Trump was trying to have him murdered. The Proud Boys were there basically saying we were going to take him out if we got to him. He was 40 feet away from the mob, that they were going to tear him limb from limb. And he stood up and he was this big hero. But now he's walking around going, well, it's no big deal. And I don't really want to make him move.
To be fair, Mike Pence has always been a worm. And so
True.
He's not being more wormy now. He's just maintaining his worminess.
Being himself. You're right.
Exactly. But I just think that there is this message that Mike Pence is no hero. He did the bare minimum. Bare minimum is a failure on part of the Democrats to make this political. And let's be honest, no one's going to get indicted from this. No one's going to go to jail for this. The argument is in the court of public opinion. Period. End of story. And so if you do not make it clear who are villains here, you don't get extra credit because you realized it's not in my best interest to rob the bank today. I'm going to rob it next week. You don't get extra credit for that. But Heather Parton, as always, a pleasure. Folks should head over to both salon.com to read what you've been writing about this and over at Hullabaloo to read it as well. Always a pleasure. And we'll do it again soon, of course.
Thanks for having me, Sam. Have a great weekend.
You too.